Hi, I'm back. I have another extraordinary archaeological discovery of important news for all over the world. And this was also covered up. This is Simon Peter's tomb, recently discovered in Jerusalem. It wasn't recently, but it's been hidden and very well covered up. This is by F. Paul Peterson, St. Peter's Tomb, the discovery of Peter's tomb in Jerusalem, 1953. So it wasn't recent, and it was covered up. But it's an extraordinary discovery. And Simon Peter is one of my best friends that I wrote about in my book, and I understood him in ways that you cannot even imagine. You know, the Bible says, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. Well, that's really what happened when I was writing my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel. And I wrote about Simon Peter and the vision that he had and other details. And so he really became a good friend. So I have to tell his story here. While visiting a friend in Switzerland, I heard of what seemed to me one of the greatest discoveries since the time of Christ, the Messiah, that Simon Peter was buried in Jerusalem and not in Rome. The source of this rumor, written in Italian, was not clear. It left considerable room for doubt, or rather wonder. Rome was the place where I could investigate the matter, and if such proved encouraging, a trip to Jerusalem might be necessary in order to gather valuable first-hand information on the subject. I therefore went to Rome, and after talking to many priests and investigating various sources of information, I finally was greatly rewarded by learning where I could buy the only known book on the subject, which was also written in Italian, and it's called Gli Scavi de Dominus Flevit, printed in 1958 at the Tipografi del Pipi Francescani in Jerusalem. It was written by P.B. Bagatti and J.T. Millick, both Roman Catholic priests. The story of the discovery was there, but it seemed to be purposely hidden, for much was lacking, and I consequently determined to go to Jerusalem to see for myself, if possible, that which appeared to be almost unbelievable, especially since it came from priests who naturally, because of the existing tradition that Simon Peter was buried in Rome, would be the last ones to welcome such a discovery or to bring it to the attention of the world. I consequently determined to go to Jerusalem to see for myself, if possible, that which appeared to be almost unbelievable, especially since it came from priests, who naturally, because of the existing tradition that Simon Peter was buried in Rome, would be the last ones to welcome such a discovery or to bring it to the attention of the world, which I intend to do right now. In Jerusalem, I spoke to many Franciscan priests who all read, finally, though reluctantly, that the bones of Simon Barjona, St. Peter, were found in Jerusalem on the Franciscan monastery site called Dominus Flevit, where Jesus supposed to have wept over Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. And that gives me the chills, because maybe that's because Jesus knew these people that were his friends were going to be buried there. And that's part of the reason why he wept, because he knew they were going to die and be buried there. That's not the whole reason why he wept, because he wept over Jerusalem, Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots, who refused to believe in him and therefore will go through the time of Jacob's trouble in the future, according to his own word in the gospel accounts and in the book of Revelation. The pictures show the story. The first show an excavation where the names of the Christian biblical characters were found on the ossuaries, bone boxes. The names of Mary and Martha were found on one box, and right next to it was one with the name of Lazarus, their brother. Other names of early Christians that I told you in this last video were found on other boxes with the sign of the cross. Of greatest interest, however, was that which was found within 12 feet from the place where the remains of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were found, the remains of Simon Peter. 12 feet apart they were buried. So you mean to tell me that this was hidden on purpose and never told to the world? And they were buried 12 feet apart, and they were the best of friends with Jesus? And on their ossuaries was the cross and the name of Yeshua with the cross. And it said Yeshua is Lord on some of these ossuaries, meaning he's God. They were found in an ossuary, on the outside of which was clearly and beautifully written in Aramaic, Simon Bar-Jonah, which would have been Bar-Yonah. The charcoal inscription reads, Shimon Bar-Yonah, which reads Simon Peter, son of Jonah, which is Matthew 16:17. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. Now, do you think that Jesus wept on that spot where they're storing these ossuaries that they dug up? And here is the name Simon Bar-Jonah on his ossuary. And here is the ossuary. Of course, he was crucified upside down, so it's possible that his ossuary is a strange shape because maybe he still had the nails in him, or maybe they had to pry him off the cross to bury him in that. He's my friend, you guys. I'm so close to Simon Bar-Jonah, and I love him. And I say that because I studied him, and the Lord revealed so many things about his vision and other things about him. And he's not at all how people characterize him. Okay, it goes on to say, I talked to a Yale professor who is an archaeologist and was director of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. And he told me that it would be very improbable that a name with 3 words and one so complete could refer to any other than St. Peter. Let me show you the inscription here. Okay, you see it's written backwards. Simon Bar-Jonah, which is Yonah in Hebrew. But what makes the probability of error more remote is that the remains were found in a Christian burial ground, and more yet of the 1st century. And not only that, but this was a Jewish cemetery of the 1st century Christians, the very time in which Simon Peter lived. In fact, I have a letter from a noted scientist stating that he can tell by the writing that it was written just before the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 AD. I talked to priest Milik, the co-writer of this Italian book, in the presence of my friend, a Christian Arab, Mr. S.J. Matar, who now is the warden of the garden tomb where Jesus was buried and rose again. This priest, Milik, admitted that he knew that the bones of Simon Peter are not in Rome. I was very much surprised that he would admit that. So to confirm his admittance, I said, to which he also agreed, there is 100 times more evidence that Simon Peter was buried in Jerusalem than in Rome. And this was something of an understatement, for he knew, as I know, that there is absolutely no evidence at all that Simon Peter was buried in Rome. I have spoken on the subject to many Franciscan priests who either were or had been in Jerusalem, and they all agree that the tomb and remains of Simon Peter are in Jerusalem. And there was just one exception, which is interesting, and which only proves the point. The Franciscan priest, Augusto Spikerman, who was in charge of the semi-private museum inside the walls of Old Jerusalem by the site of the Franciscan Church of the Flagellation, was that exception. When I asked to see the museum, he showed it to the 3 of us. Mr. Matar, who in addition to being warden of the Tomb of Christ, had been the manager of an English bank in Jerusalem, a professional photographer, and myself. But he told us nothing of the discovery. I knew that the evidence of Simon Peter's burial was there, for priests had told me that relics from the Christian burial ground, which was Jewish, was preserved within this museum. People who lived in Jerusalem all their lives and official guides who are supposed to know every inch of the city, however, knew nothing of this discovery. So well was it withheld from the public. That is a disgrace. I had asked an elderly official guide where the tomb of St. Peter was, and he responded in a very profound and majestic tone of voice, "The tomb of St. Peter has never been found in Jerusalem." "Oh," I said, "but I've seen the burial place of Simon Peter with my own eyes." He turned on me with a fierceness that is so common among these Arabs. "What?" he replied. "You're a foreigner, mean to tell me that you know where the tomb of St. Peter is when I have been an official guide for 35 years and know every inch of the ground in Jerusalem?" I was afraid that he would jump at my throat, and I managed to calm him as I said, "But sir, here are the pictures, and you can see the ossuary among others with Simon Peter's name in Aramaic. And you can also see this for yourself on the Mount of Olives on the Franciscan convent site called Dominus Flevit." And when I finished, he slowly turned away in stunned amazement. A person who has seen this Christian burial ground and knows the circumstances surrounding the case could never doubt that this truly is the burial place of Simon Peter and of other Christians. I, too, walked around in a dreamy amazement for about a week, for I could hardly believe what I had seen and heard. Since the circulation of this article, they do not allow anyone to see this burial place. But I'm going to see it. I'm going to go see it at some point. Before things had gone very far, I had been quite discouraged, for I could get no information from the many priests with whom I had talked. However, I continued questioning priests wherever I would find them. Finally, one priest dropped some information. With that knowledge, I approached another priest who warily asked me where I had acquired that information. And I told him that a priest had told me. And then he admitted the point and dropped a little more information. It went on like that for some time until I got the whole picture, and I was finally directed to where I could see the evidence for myself. To get the story, it made me feel as though I had a bull by the tail and were trying to pull him through a keyhole. But when I had gathered all the facts in the case, the priests could not deny the discovery of the tomb, but even confirmed it, though reluctantly. In fact, I have the statement from a Spanish priest on the Mount of Olives on a tape recorder to that effect. And let me show you something here. This is part of the ossuary. On the middle stone, which is showing in this picture, found in this excavation, one sees a mark which is the first two letters of the Greek word, which means Christ or Messiah. Okay? And in this one, we clearly see the cross here. There's a cross with Simon Bar-Yona. But here we were talking to this Franciscan priest in charge of the museum, asking him questions, which he tried to evade, but could not because of the information I had already gathered from the many priests with whom I had spoken. And finally, after the pictures of the evidence were taken, which was nothing short of a miracle that he allowed us to do so, I complimented him on the marvelous discovery of the tomb of Simon Peter in Jerusalem that the Franciscans had made. He was clearly nervous as he said, "Oh no, the tomb of St. Peter is in Rome." But as he said that, his voice faltered, a fact which even my friend Mr. Matar had noticed. when I looked him squarely in the eyes and firmly said, "No, the tomb of St. Peter is in Jerusalem." He looked at me like a guilty schoolboy and held his peace. He was no doubt placed there to hide the facts, but his actions and words spoke more convincingly about the discovery than those priests who finally admitted the truth. I also spoke to a Franciscan priest in authority at the priest printing plant within the walls of Old Jerusalem, where their book on the subject was printed. He also admitted that the tomb of St. Peter is in Jerusalem. Then, when I visited the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, I encountered a Franciscan monk. After telling him what I thought of the wonderful discovery the Franciscans had made, I asked him plainly, "Do you folks really believe that these are the remains of St. Peter?" And he responded, "Yes, we do. We have no choice in the matter. The clear evidence is there." I did not doubt the evidence, but what surprised me was that these priests and monks believed that which was against their own religion, and on top of that, to admit it to others was something out of this world. Usually a Catholic, either because he's brainwashed or stubbornly doesn't want to see anything, only that which he has been taught, will not allow himself to believe anything against his religion, much less to admit it to others. But there is a growing healthy attitude among many Catholics to prove all things, hold fast to that which is good, as the Master admonished us all. And then I asked, does Father Bagatti, co-writer of the book in Italian on the subject and archaeologist, really believe that those are the bones of St. Peter? Yes, he does, was the reply. And then I asked, but what does the Pope think of all this? And that was a $1,000 question, and he gave me $1 million answer. Well, he confidently answered in a hushed voice. Father Bagatti told me personally that 3 years ago he went to the Pope in Rome and showed him the evidence. And the Pope said to him, "Well, we will have to make some changes, but for the time being, keep this thing quiet." In awe, I asked also in a subdued voice, "So the Pope really believes that these are the bones of St. Peter?" "Yes," was his answer. "The documentary evidence is there, and he could not help but believe." I visited various renowned archaeologists on the subject. Dr. Albright of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore told me that he personally knew Priest Bagatti and that he was a very competent archaeologist. I also spoke with Dr. Nelson Gluck, archaeologist and president of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. I showed him the pictures found in this article, but being with him for only a few minutes, I therefore could not show him the wealth of material that you have before you in this article. However, he quickly recognized the Aramaic words to be Simon Bar Jonah. Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew. I asked him if he would write a statement to that effect, and he said to do so would cast a reflection on the competency of the priest J.T. Millick, who he knew to be a very able scientist. But he said that he would write a note. I quote, "I regard Father J.T. Millick as a first-class scholar in the Semitic field," he added. "I do not consider that names on ossuaries are conclusive evidence that they are those of the apostles." Nelson Gluck. I quote this letter of Dr. Gluck because it shows that the priest Millick is a competent archaeologist. As I have mentioned, I was only able to be with him for a few minutes and was not able to show him but a very small part of the evidence. Anyone, including myself, would readily agree with Dr. Gluck that if only the name Simon Bar Jonah on the ossuary was all the evidence that was available, it would not be conclusive evidence that it was of the Apostle Peter, though it would certainly be a strong indication. The story of the cave and the ossuaries and the regular cemetery just outside the convent site is this. It was a Roman custom that when a person had died, and after about 10 years when the body had decomposed, the grave would be opened. The bones would be placed in a small ossuary with the name of the person carefully written on the outside front. And these ossuaries would then be placed in a cave, as in the case of this Christian Jewish burial ground, and thus making room for others. But this cave or burial place where the ossuaries were found, and which was created and brought about through the natural impartial and disinterested sequence of events without any reason to change facts or circumstances was a greater testimony than if there were a witness recorded stating that Simon Peter was buried there. And yet, even that is unmistakably recorded in 3 words in Aramaic of the Ossuary, Simon Bar-Jonah, or Yonah. And herein lies the greatest proof that Simon Peter never was a pope and never was in Rome. For if he had been, it would have certainly been proclaimed in the New Testament. History, likewise, would not have been silent on the subject, as they were not silent in the case of Apostle Paul. Even the Catholic history would have claimed the above as a fact and not as a fickle tradition. To omit Simon Peter as being pope and in Rome, in the papacy, would be like omitting the law of Moses or the prophets or the Acts of the Apostles from the Bible. Dr. Glueck, being Jewish and having been to Jerusalem, no doubt, is fully aware of the fact that for centuries the Catholic Church bought up what were thought to be holy sites, some of which did not stand up to biblical description. For instance, the priests say that the tomb of Jesus is within the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, in a hole in the ground, whereas the Bible says that the tomb where Jesus was laid was hewn out of rock and a stone was rolled in front and not on top of it. The garden tomb at the foot of Golgotha, outside the walls of old Jerusalem, meets the biblical description perfectly. In fact, all those who were hated by the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, as Jesus was, could never have been allowed to be buried within the gates of the holy city. The tomb where Jesus lay was made for Joseph of Arimathea. His family were all stout and short of stature. In this burial place, you can see to this day where someone had carved deeper into the wall to make room for Jesus, who was said to be about 6 feet tall. Now, here's the thing about that. So, in the garden tomb, there's an extension at the end of where his body lay, and it allows for a taller person to be buried there. But I had a belief. If you look at the image on the shroud, you can see that his feet are still in that bent down position, and I believe they were kind of stuck in that position, and that they had to extend that because his feet were dead and they were stuck in that crucified position. You'll see that position on the shroud. So they had to extend it, I believe, because his feet could not be bent upward because they were stiff. And that makes perfect sense to me. That's my own belief on the matter, from what the Lord revealed to me about that. Pope Pius XII delivered the Assumption of Mary to be an article of faith in 1950. The Catholic Church in Jerusalem then quickly sold the tomb of Mary to the Armenian Church. Ex-priest Lavallo told me personally that there is another tomb of St. Mary in Ephesus, which I've seen. Now remember, that's where John the Apostle was, and Mary was living with John after the crucifixion, and he went to Ephesus. But the tomb of St. Peter is altogether different, for they would rather that it never existed, and to buy or sell such a site would be out of the question. It fell upon them in this manner, as I was told by a Franciscan monk of the monastery of Dominus Flevit. One of their members was spading the ground on this site in 1953 when his shovel fell through. Excavation was started, and there a large underground Christian burial ground was uncovered. The initial of Christ in Greek was written there, which would never have been found in a Jewish, Arab, or pagan cemetery. By the structure of the writings, it was established by scientists that they were of the days just before the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 A.D. On the ossuaries were found many names of the Christians of the early church. It was prophesied in the Bible that Jesus would stand on the Mount of Olives at his return to earth. You can see then how the Christians would be inclined to have their burial ground on the Mount of Olives. For here also had been a favorite meeting place of Jesus and his disciples. Not to mention the fact that he ascended up from the Mount of Olives. In all of the cemetery, nothing was found, as also in the catacombs in Rome, which resemble Arab, Jewish, or Catholic or pagan practices. Dr. Gluck, being Jewish, is not fully aware, no doubt, that such a discovery is very embarrassing, since it undermines the very foundation of the Roman Catholic Church. Since Simon Peter did not live in Rome and therefore was not martyred or buried there, it naturally follows that he was not their first pope. In fact, I'm told that their first pope was actually a Jewish person. The Catholic Church says that Simon Peter was pope in Rome from 41 to 66 AD, a period of 25 years. But the Bible shows a very different story. The book of the Acts of the Apostles in either the Catholic or Protestant Bible records the following. Simon Peter was preaching the gospel of the circumcision, the Jews, in Caesarea and Joppa in Palestine, ministering unto the household of Cornelius, which was a distance of 1,800 miles from Rome, in Acts 10, 23, 24. Soon after, about the year 44 AD, in Acts 12, Simon Peter was cast into prison in Jerusalem by Herod, but he was released by an angel. From 46 to 52 AD, we read in the 13th chapter that he was in Jerusalem preaching the difference between law and grace. Saul was converted in 34 AD and became Paul the Apostle in Acts 9. Paul tells us that 3 years after his conversion in 37 AD, he went up to Jerusalem to see Simon Peter. Galatians 1:18, and in 51 AD, 14 years later, he again went up to Jerusalem in Galatians 2:1 and 8. Simon Peter being mentioned. Soon after that, he met Simon Peter in Antioch, and as Paul says, withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed in Galatians 2:11. The evidence is abundant. The truth is clear from the scriptures, which have never failed. It would be breathtaking to read of the boldness of Paul in dealing with Simon Peter. Very few, if any, have withstood a pope and lived, except in the days when everybody seemed to withstand him. If Simon Peter were pope, it would have been no different. Paul does not only withstand Simon Peter, but rebukes him and blames him of being at fault. This reminds me of my visit to the St. Angelo Castle in Rome. This castle, which is a very strong fortress, is connected with the Vatican by a high-arched viaduct of about a mile in length, over which popes have fled in times of danger. The Roman Catholic guide showed me a prison room which had a small airtight chamber in it, and he told me that a cardinal who had contended with the Pope on doctrine was thrown into the airtight chamber for nearly 2 hours until he almost smothered to death. He then was led to the death a few feet away, and you get the picture. Another thing remained with me forcibly. The guide showed me through the apartments of the various popes who had taken refuge there. In each case, he also showed me the apartment of the mistresses of each of the popes. I was amazed that he made no attempt to hide anything, and I asked him, "Are you not a Catholic?" And he humbly answered, "Oh yes, I'm a Catholic, but I'm ashamed of the history of many of the popes. But I trust that our modern popes are better." I then asked him, "Surely you're aware of the affair between Pope Pius XII and his housekeeper. Many in Rome say that she ran the affairs of the Pope and the Vatican as well." And he hung his head in shame and sadly said, "Yes, I know." All this explains why the Catholic Church has been so careful to keep this discovery unknown. They were successful in doing just that from 1953, when it was discovered by the Franciscans on their own convent site, until 1959. And having succeeded for so long in keeping this thing quiet, quote unquote, as the Pope had admonished. They were off guard when a fellow at that time came along who appeared harmless but persistent. Little did they know that this fellow would publish the news everywhere. And I will continue to do this too. Their position is shaky enough without this discovery becoming generally known. As I've mentioned, I had a very agreeable talk with Priest Millick, but I did not have the opportunity to see Priest Bugatti while in Jerusalem. I wrote to him, however, on March 15th, 1960, as follows, quote, I have spoken with a number of Franciscan priests and monks, and they have told me about you in the book of which you are co-author. I had hoped to see you and compliment you on such a great discovery, but time would not permit. Having heard so much about you and that you are an archaeologist with the evidence at hand, I was convinced with you concerning the ancient burial ground that the remains found in the ossuary with the name on it, Simon Bar-Jonah, written in Aramaic, were those of St. Peter. It's remarkable that in his reply, he did not contradict my statement, which he certainly could have done if he honestly would have done so. I was very much convinced with you that the remains found in the cemetery were those of Simon Peter. And this confirms the talk I had with the Franciscan monk in Bethlehem and the story he told me of the priest Bagatti's going to the Pope with the evidence concerning the bones of St. Peter in Jerusalem. In his letter, one can see that he is careful because of the Pope's admonition to keep this discovery quiet. And he therefore wrote me that he leaves the whole explanation of the Aramaic word Simon Bar-Jonah to Priest Millick. This is a familiar way of getting out of a similar situation. In Priest Bagatti's letter, one can see that he is in a difficult position. He cannot go against what he had written in 1953 at the time of the discovery of this Christian Jewish burial ground, nor what he had said to the Franciscan monk about his visit to the Pope. However, he does raise a question which helps him to get out of the situation without altogether contradicting himself, and at the same time putting a smokescreen around the truth. He wrote, supposing that it is Jonah on the ossuary, as I believe, it may be some other relative of St. Peter, because names were passed on from family to family. To be able to propose the identification of it with St. Peter would go against a long tradition, which has its own value. Anyway, another volume will come soon that will demonstrate that the cemetery was Christian and of the 1st century to the 2nd century AD. The salute in God, most devoted, P.B. Bugatti, CFM. As I have mentioned, I had a very agreeable talk with Priest Millick. As I have shown after the admonition of the Pope to keep this thing quiet, Priest Bugatti leaves the interpretation of the whole matter to Priest Millick, who offers several suggestions, but in the end declares that the original statement of Priest Bugatti may be true, that the inscription and the remains are of Simon Peter. It is also very interesting and highly significant that Priest Bugatti, in his attempt to neutralize his original statement and the consternation the discovery had, and would have it, if it were generally known, says in reference to the name Simon Bar-Jonah, St. Peter, it may be some other relative of St. Peter, because names were passed on from generation to generation. In other words, he says that Simon Peter's name, Simon Bar-Jonah, could have been given him from a relative of the same name of generations before him, or could belong to a relative generations after St. Peter. Both speculations are beyond the realm of the possible. First of all, it could not refer to a relative before St. Peter, for the Christian burial ground could only have come into being after Jesus began his public ministry and had converts, and therefore could not belong to a relative before Peter's time, since only those who were converted through Christ's ministry were buried there. Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD and left it desolate. Therefore, it is impossible that the inscription could refer to a relative of Peter's time. That's just such a preposterous idea. One encyclopedia explains the destruction in these words: With this event, the history of ancient Jerusalem came to a close. For it was left desolate, and its inhabitants were scattered abroad. From all evidence, Simon Peter was about 50 years old when Jesus called him to be an apostle, and he died around the age of 82, or about the year 62 AD. And since by these figures there was only 8 years left from the time of Simon Peter's death until the destruction of Jerusalem, it was then impossible that the inscription and remains belonged to generations after Peter. In those days, names were passed on to another only after a lapse of many years. But let us say that immediately after the death of St. Peter, a baby was christened Simon Bar-Jonah. The inscription still could not have been of this baby, for the remains were of an adult and not of a child of 8 years, who had died just before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, at which time the history of ancient Jerusalem came to a close, for it was left desolate and its inhabitants were scattered abroad. So all of that is just a made-up lie that they're trying to cover their bases to deny it was Simon Peter's grave. This ancient Christian Jewish burial ground shows that Simon Peter died and was buried in Jerusalem, which is easily understandable since neither history nor the Bible tells of Simon Peter's having been in Rome. To make matters more clear, the Bible tells us that Simon Peter was the apostle to the Jews. It was Paul who was the apostle to the Gentiles, and both history and the Bible tells us of his being in Rome. No wonder that the Roman Catholic bishop Strossmayer, in his great speech against papal infallibility before the Pope and the Council of 1870 said, Scaliger, one of the most learned men, has not hesitated to say that St. Peter episcopate and residence in Rome ought to be classed with ridiculous legends. Eusebius, one of the most learned men of his time, wrote that the church history up to the year 325 AD, he said that Simon Peter never was in Rome. And this church history was translated by Jerome from the original Greek. But in his translation, he added a fantastic story of Peter's residence in Rome. And this is a common practice in trying to create credence in their doctrines using false statements, false letters, and falsified history. This is another reason why we cannot rely on tradition, but only on the infallible Word of God. The secrecy surrounding this case is amazing and disgusting and understandable, since Catholics largely base their faith on the assumption that Peter was their first pope and that he was martyred and buried there. But I am somewhat of the opinion that the Franciscan priests, those who are honest, would be glad to see the truth proclaimed, even if it displeased those who are over them. While visiting with Priest Milik, I told him of the highly educated priest with whom I had spoken just before going from Rome to Jerusalem, and he admitted to me that the remains of Simon Peter are not in the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican. I asked him what had happened to them, and he replied, "We don't know, but we think that the Saracens stole them away." First of all, the Saracens never got in Rome, but even if they had, what would they have wanted with the bones of Simon Peter? But they never got to Rome, so there it ends. We had a good laugh together, but more so when I told him of my discussion with a brilliant American priest in Rome, and I asked this American priest if he knew that the bones of Simon Peter were not in the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican, and he admitted that they were not there. However, he said that a good friend of his, an archaeologist, had been excavating under St. Peter's Basilica for the bones of St. Peter for a number of years, and 5 years ago he found them. Now a man can be identified by his fingerprints, but never by his bones. So I asked him how he knew that they were the bones of Simon Peter, and he hesitated and tried to change the subject. But on my insistence, he finally explained that they had taken the bones to a chemist and they were analyzed, and it was judged that the bones were of a man who had died at about the age of 65. Therefore, they must be Peter's. How ridiculous can people be? So that's a lie. They were not the bones of Simon Peter, the ones that they claimed were in Rome. Mark you, all the priests agree that the Vatican and St. Peter's were built over a pagan cemetery, and this was a very appropriate place for them to build, since, as even Cardinal Newman admitted, there are many pagan practices in the Roman Catholic Church. You realize surely that the Christians would never bury their dead in a pagan cemetery, and neither would Jews or Jewish Christians. And you may be very sure that pagans would never allow a Christian to be buried in this cemetery. So even if Simon Peter died in Rome, which is out of the question, surely the pagan cemetery under St. Peter's Basilica would be the last place in which he would have been buried. Also, Simon Peter, from every indication, lived to be over 80 and not 65 years old. The Pope was right going back to the early Christian burial ground. They must have made changes in many of them, and fundamental ones at that. But I am afraid that the Pope's Pius XII's admittance of the discovery on Bagotti's presentation of the documentary evidence was to satisfy Bagotti, but at the same time admonishing him to keep the information quiet, hoping that the truth of the discovery would die out. How anti-Christian can you be? But they have said that after all these years of excavation under the Vatican, they have discovered Greek words which read, Peter is buried here. And it gives the date of 160 AD. First of all, the very structure of the sentence immediately gives one the impression that either quite recently or long ago, someone put the sign there hoping it would be taken as authentic in order to establish that which then and even now has never been proven. Then there is a discrepancy in the date. For Simon Peter was martyred around the year 62 AD and not 160 AD. Thirdly, why is it that they mention nothing about finding bones under or around the sign? While visiting the catacombs, one sees a few things which are not becoming to Christians, but which tend to indicate that the Christians had some pagan practices similar to those of Rome today. Nothing is said about them, and only after persistent questioning will the Roman Catholic priest who acts as a guide tell you that those things, images, etc., were placed there centuries after the early Christian era, so are not true. In 1950, just a few years prior to the discovery of the Christian Jewish burial ground in Jerusalem, the Pope made the strange declaration that the bones of St. Peter were found under St. Peter's in Rome. Strange it was, for since beginning to build the church in 1450, finished in 1626, they erected St. Peter's tomb under the large dome and Bernini's serpentine columns. Since then, multiplied millions were thereby deceived into believing that the remains of St. Peter were there, which the hierarchy had all along known was not true, as is proven by the late Pope's declaration. The following was published in the Newsweek of July 1st, 1957. Quote, "It was in 1950 that Pope Pius XII, in his Christmas message, announced that the tomb of St. Peter had indeed been found, as tradition held, beneath the immense dome of the cathedral. There was, however, no evidence that the bones discovered there belonged to the body of the martyr." The parentheses are Newsweek's. To make an announcement of such importance when there's absolutely no evidence is rather ridiculous, as also brought out in the Time magazine of October 28, 1957. As in above, we quote the article word for word, which says, "A thorough account in English of the discoveries beneath St. Peter's is now available by British archaeologists Jocelyn Tonby and John Ward Perkins. The authors were not members of the excavating team, but scholars Toynbee, a Roman Catholic, and Perkins, an Anglican, pored over the official Vatican reports, painstakingly examined the diggings. Their careful, independent conclusions fall short of the Pope and his flat statement. The Pope's statement that the remains of St. Peter were found under St. Peter's in Rome. The excavation under St. Peter's for the remains of St. Peter or the remains of St. Peter are still going on secretly in spite of the Pope's declaration of 1950. Then, in 1965, an archaeologist at Rome University, Professor Margherita Guarducci, tells of a set of bones belonging to Peter. The story was fantastic, but lacked common sense and even bordered on the infantile. But a drowning man will grab for a straw, and a straw it was to many. But the Palo Alto Times in California, May 9th, 1967, came out with an article on the subject, and I quote, "Other experts, among them Monsignor Joseph Roychart, vice prefect of the Vatican Library, are not convinced by Miss Guarducci's evidence. There are too many unknowns," he told reporters on a recent tour of the Vatican grottos, "and there's no continuous tracing of the bones. We lack historical proof, and they could be anyone's bones there. The Vatican would seem to be on the Monsignor's side because so far it has taken no steps to officially recognize the bones in St. Peter's," continues the article. "The intelligent priest of whom I have mentioned said that Simon Peter's bones were found, and he was a man who died of about 62 years of age. The tests indicated." Pope Pius XII declared these bones were the bones of St. Peter in his Christmas message of 1950, and these were the same as claimed by Newsweek. There was, however, no evidence that the bones uncovered there belonged to the body of the martyr Peter, as well as the above doubtful statements of the archaeologists working on the cave. The Pope, notwithstanding, was overjoyed to think that they had found the bones of Simon Peter, until further examination proved that these bones were those of a woman. The fact came out in an article on the subject in SF Chronicle of June 27th of 1968. So that's just so laughable. To continue the history of another case in which they have erred, in spite of the statements by the high papal authority above, and the resilient lesson that should have been learned, the Pope a year later claimed the Professor Margherita bones as his very own, that is, those of St. Peter. When the bones were found, there was little importance placed upon them, and they were filed away as such. But when the first set of Peter's bones turned out so tragically, there was a vacuum left and something had to be done. Again, they turned their thoughts to the filed away bones, the only hope they had of success. In them, there was a ray of hope, for the bones were minus a skull, which could go along with the story of the supposed skull of St. Peter, which had for centuries been guarded in the Church of St. Peter in Rome. With a generous mixture of ideas, suppositions, theories, and wishful thinking, a fairly logical story emerged. It was then declared by Pope Paul as the gospel truth that these now were the genuine bones of St. Peter and must of the faithful be accepted by them as such. And for a while, all was well until another hitch developed. And this time, as fate would have it, the bones in connection with the skull, which was guarded for centuries as that of St. Peter, were found incompatible to the more recent bones of St. Peter. The dilemma was terrible, and they were between the devil and the deep blue sea. They have juggled around the skull of St. Peter, causing confusion, and it was a choice of claiming these bones, championed by Professor Margherita, as fake, or claiming as fake the skull accepted by hundreds of popes as that of St. Peter. They rejected the past rather than expose themselves to the ridicule of the present Professor Margherita claims in this article, which appeared in the Manchester Guardian in London, as well as the SF Chronicle of June 27th of 1968, concerning the long-accepted skull of St. Peter as it is a fake. And then the article continues. The hundreds of popes and millions of Roman Catholics who have accepted and venerated the other skull were innocent victims of another early tradition that's a fraud. But the most astounding statement in the long article found in the above mentioned newspaper is the professor did not submit them, Peter's bones, to modern scientific tests, which would have determined the approximate age, because she feared that the process would have reduced them to dust. How could any scientific study of bones be carried out without first scientifically determining the age of the person or the bones? And this would be of the greatest interest and the most important for further research. Also, any scientist or chemist knows that you do not have to submit the whole skeleton for testing to determine the age. A part of the shin bone or of a rib would be sufficient. It appears that she was protecting her Peter's bones from another possible disaster, which a wrong age would have caused. The Vatican and others have circulated through all existing evidence that Peter lived to be around 80 to 82 years, and that he died around the years of 62 to 64 AD. These figures go along perfectly, as does everything else in the case, with the remains found in the Jewish Christian burial ground in the Mount of Olives and in the ossuary, on which was clearly and beautifully written Simon Bar-Jonah in Aramaic. The following was taken from the book Races of Mankind, page 161. Stained attempts to have Peter the Apostle to the Hebrews of the East in Paul's territory in Rome and martyred there were unworthy of serious consideration in light of all the contemporary evidence. At his age, 82, that would not have been practicable. In none of Paul's writings is there the slightest insinuation that Simon Peter ever had been or was at that city of Rome. All statements to the contrary were made centuries later and are fanciful and hearsay. The papacy was not organized until the second half of the 8th century. It broke away from the Eastern Church in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 13th edition, volume 21, page 636, under Pippin III. Also, the papacy by Abbé Guyet. The great historian Schaff states that the idea of Simon Peter being in Rome is irreconcilable with the silence of the scriptures, and even with the mere fact of Paul's epistle to the Romans. In the year 58, Paul wrote his epistle to the Roman church, but does not mention Simon Peter, although he does name 28 leaders of the church at Rome in Romans 16:7. It must therefore be concluded that if the whole subject faced with detached objectivity, the conclusion must inevitably be reached that Simon Peter was never in Rome. Paul lived and wrote in Rome, but he declared that only Luke is with me in 1 Timothy 4:11. This is a copy in 1960 by F. Paul Peterson, 4th edition, 1971. And in that little booklet or book, the Dominus Flevit, they had diagrams of not only St. Peter's inscription, but they also had a photo overview of the site number 79, the photo of the ossuary of Mary and Martha at site number 70 in the Jewish Christian cemetery. So The fact is, Mary and Martha were sisters, and their bones apparently were put in the same ossuary. And there was a picture of it in situ as they found it, and I saw it. But it is no longer available, apparently, to be seen because it's been hidden, and all of this is evil as can be. The very fact that you had Simon Peter buried on the road to Bethany, where Jesus went with his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, where they were buried, and Simeon the priest is buried there, that circumcised the baby Messiah, and others were there, Salome, which was with Mary when she went to the tomb. And all of this is a huge cover-up. I have to tell this story because I cannot believe that something so extraordinary has been hidden from the public all this time. So they're denying that that's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus on the road to Bethany on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus ascended up, and where he met with his disciples constantly on the Mount of Olives to pray. And Simon Peter is buried 12 feet from Lazarus, Mary and Martha, and Simeon the priest, and these others, Salome and Judah, her husband, which are the parents of the sons of Zebedee. This is the biggest cover-up in history, you guys. Not only of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus and these others, Simeon the priest, but of Simon Peter. 12 feet apart was their burial place. And 12 is such an important number. Of the 12 tribes of Israel, Simon Peter was Jewish. These people were Jewish. This was a Jewish Christian cemetery. And they were buried, and crosses with the name Yeshua was on some of the ossuaries. And not only that, but Yeshua, Jesus is Lord, meaning he's God. And they would have been buried just about 8 years. You know, I don't know about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, their exact date. But according to this, Simon Peter would have been buried approximately only about 8 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And this is extraordinary research in history, and no one else is telling you these things. I have got to bring this forward because I wrote about some of these people, and I got to know them so intimately and deeply in the scriptures that I felt like they were my friends, and I want to bring their story forward because it is totally a cover-up. And with that, I'll say, I know this is a longer video, so I'll just say, I am revealing the truth to you, and Jesus is coming soon, and he's going to reward those who tell the truth and don't hide the glory of the Messiah from the world. So I'm proclaiming the truth that the King of Kings is Jesus, the Messiah, our Redeemer and Savior of the world. With that, I'll say good night and shalom, and I'll see you in the next one.